So
Sure, go
just a
ahead.
few housekeeping items for everybody. In the chat box, I did put the link for the handout for today's class. It is also on the Tri-County's website under the Education tab. The Tri-County's website is tricorealtors. Let's see, I just went blank. tricorealtors.com. And but it's also in the chat, like I said. He's going to be going over the forms. Ed will be going over the forms, and if you wouldn't mind putting your questions in the question and answer box, and then that way it's easier for me to keep track of the questions in the question and answer box versus chat. And then as the questions come in, I will field them to Ed, and we'll see if we can't get all of them answered for you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Edwin Estes Esquire with Mount San Antonio College.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Laura. I do appreciate you getting us online. And just to let everybody know, we will answer all questions, and I even have reserved time at the end of the slideshow to answer any more questions. We do try to keep all the mics off because I guess we've got maybe 40, 50 people coming into this seminar. And of course, if you all were to join in, we would never actually get through it. So be patient with us. And as I go through the forms, we will stop at the end of each form, take questions on it. The other thing I want to let you know, a little bit of a disclaimer and an apology. These forms are updating almost weekly. So there have been a couple of forms that have updated. So your handout will not necessarily be completely current. But what I've just told Laura is I'm going to be updating this handout this afternoon. I will send it to her again. She will then post it. And if you do want to download it, you can do those with the current version of forms. But essentially, the content has not changed, okay? How the forms work, what the forms do, they are going to remain the same. So let's go ahead and get into the program. And first thing I'd like to do as people are still coming into the class is just review some common sense precautions. And, you know, everybody now, as they're wearing gloves, they're wearing masks. First of all, with your mask, make sure your mask covers both your mouth and your nose. Just covering your mouth is not going to protect anybody because you're still breathing out of your nose. So your mask, to give protection to others, needs to cover your mouth and your nose. Also remember, the mask is not going to protect you. The mask is to protect others from you in case you have COVID and you are asymptomatic, which means you're not showing any symptoms. And it appears that the majority of people out there are not showing symptoms for this disease. So we just need to keep that in mind. Second, let's talk a little bit about gloves. There's a misnomer on gloves as well. People somehow think that gloves is going to protect you from contracting the virus. That's partly true. What I mean by that is if your hands become contaminated and then you touch your face, and again, we believe the virus comes through a membrane, your mouth, your nose, or your eyes. So if you have it on your hands and you touch your face, then you could become infected. So while the mask will protect others from you, it's not going to protect you from somebody else who doesn't have a mask and is coughing and sneezing, because once that virus becomes airborne, it could actually come to you or infect you via your eyes. So again, the mask will protect others from you, doesn't necessarily protect you. What protects you? Social distancing, staying at least 6 feet apart. Now, proper use of gloves. So my recommendation here is if you're going to show a home, as you get out of your car, go to your trunk and put on gloves. Now, most people, when they think of gloves, they think of those latex surgical gloves. They're rather difficult to find right now because medical personnel need those. my recommendation is go online, see if you can find some culinary gloves. These are plastic gloves that caterers often use when they are dealing with food. They're cheaper, they're more accessible, and the fact that they're not used by medical personnel, there's less competition for them. So if you're showing a house or you're previewing a property, go to your trunk, put on these gloves, then access the lockbox, get your key, open the house, go through the house, again, avoiding touching surfaces, even though you have gloves on. When you leave the house, secure the property, go back, return the key to the lockbox, then go to your trunk and then carefully peel the gloves off so you don't touch the surface and dispose of them in a container in your trunk. Please don't throw them on the ground like they do outside of Ralph's and Stater Brothers. You're just creating a hazmat situation. What you've now done is you have kept your hands relatively sterile. If there was a virus on the lockbox or on anything that you touched, they have now not contaminated your hands. So now when you get back into your car is remaining essentially clean. So again, I also recommend when you get into your car, use hand sanitizers. They're not as effective as soap and water. Soap and water is better, but hand sanitizers, because they have a disinfectant, will keep your hands disinfected a little bit longer because they have that disinfectant on them. So warm water. Why do we use warm water to wash our hands? Because we tend to wash our hands for a longer period of time. Will warm water be more effective at killing a virus? No. You'd have to get that water to scalding, boiling, before it would actually kill a virus. So again, the purpose of soap and warm water is you will wash your hands a little bit longer, about 20 seconds, and then frequent bathing. I know a lot of people who are out there in the field, as soon as they come home, they take off their shirt or their blouse, throw it in the washing machine. So there's no contamination to other parts of their clothing. And then also, I always recommend washing your hands as soon as you get home, or if you are going into the office, as soon as you come into the office, wash your hands there. Also, remember to extend courtesy to others. And that means social distancing. Keep at least 6 feet apart. No need to shake hands anymore. Ask permission. Before you show a property, always a good idea to say to the buyer, how are you feeling today? Or when you ask the seller if you can actually show the property, say, seller, how are you feeling today? If they're not feeling well, maybe not a good time to go show properties. Extend it out 2 or 3 days. Make sure people are feeling well. Even if you have a cold, even if you're suffering from allergies, the fact that you're blowing your nose, you're coughing, your eyes are watering. Again, it could be allergies, but that's going to cause people to be a little uncomfortable. So again, respect the anxiety of other people. Don't create a situation where you may cause them fear, because let's face it, a lot of us are a little afraid right now. So let's go into the first form, and this is the Coronavirus Property Entry Advisory and Declaration, or PEAD. So what does this form do? This form is essentially a disclaimer and a hold harmless. So to use an analogy, let's say you're going to go skydiving or bungee cord jumping or some other silly thing that you really shouldn't be doing. Well, before you do that, they will have you fill out a questionnaire. They will ask you, do you have any health concerns? They will ask you, da-da-da-da. They will warn you about what you're doing is not a good idea. So you're basically signing your life away, right? Exactly. Well, essentially, that's what this form does here. This form can be given to sellers and buyers. It can also be given to appraisers, home inspectors, anybody you're going to come in contact with. Now, when this form was created, I think it was designed to be given to a seller to let them know that in the marketing of their property, people are going to be coming in. Are you good with that? I think originally the CAR thought that when a buyer goes out to look at a single property, that you would give this form to them, which is why at the top there's a property address. So naturally, you're only going to have one of these forms with one address for a seller. But the question that came to me at an earlier webinar is, well, if I've got a buyer and I show them a property on Elm Street, I'll go ahead and put the property address on Elm Street. Do I have to do a new one of these forms for every property I show them? And my answer is, I don't think so. As long as you have an ongoing relationship with that buyer, I think one form will work for you. The key is to make everybody that you come in contact with sign one of these forms, give them a copy, and keep a copy for yourself. I look at it similar to what I do, that we would use the agency disclosure form. We're all familiar with the AD form. We give it to the buyer, preferably before we start showing them properties. I know eventually, in actuality, we typically don't give it to them until you actually get ready to write the offer. My policy would be treat it like the AD form, in that if you give the AD form to a buyer and you start showing them properties, you only have to give them one form. But if the buyer decides they don't want to buy and you lose contact with them for a month, 3 months, 6 months, but then they contact you and they want to see a property again, I would go ahead and give them a new AD form. I would treat this form the same way. If you're going to go out and show the buyer 3 or 4 properties on one day, do you have to give them a new one of these forms for each property? I don't think so. One form will work. But if you quit working with this buyer and 3 months later the buyer comes back and now wants to see properties again, then I would give them form again. All right, so that's kind of how I deal with this form. If you have a listing and the agent calls you up who has the buyer and wants to show the property or wants to ask you about showing procedures, I would ask that agent, has your buyer completed a PEAD form? And if they say yes, say, would you mind scanning a copy and sending it over to me for my file? If they say no, say, would you mind having your buyer do one? Put a copy in your file, send me a copy for my file. You know, if we work together with other agents, having our buyers, of course, having our seller complete this form, it just lets them know that in a COVID environment, we do run the risk when we leave our home. So that is the purpose of this form. Laura, do we have any questions regarding the PEAD form?
Just one, but I think you guys just kind of answered it, is if I view the property as the agent for my buyers, should I sign it and send it to the listing agent?
Well, I guess the question is, do you plan on suing the listing agent if you contract COVID from there? I mean, I don't see a need for agents to complete this. However, if an agent asks, would you mind signing a PEAD form on yourself? I would go ahead and do it, because all you're doing is acknowledging that there is risk in leaving your home during the COVID pandemic. If the seller or the listing agent were to ask for a copy of this form from your buyer, I would go ahead and send it over. Likewise, if the cooperating agent were to ask for a copy of this form that was signed by the seller, I would go ahead and scan it and send it over to them. You know, it's just a simple advisory, much along the same lines as, say, the AD form or the wire fraud advisory. There's nothing wrong with exchanging these forms between agents for the parties that are going inside the house. All right. Any other questions?
That's it.
All right, so let's go to the next form. This is the listing agreement coronavirus addendum amendment form. Now, you're going to hear me use the word coronavirus. You're also going to use the word COVID. Which is better? Well, COVID-19 is a lot easier to spell and write. So I typically use COVID. What's COVID mean? Well, the CO stands for corona. The VI stands for virus, and the D stands for disease. The 19 stands for 2019 when this thing erupted in Asia. So if you want to use coronavirus, you can. If you want to use COVID, COVID's a little bit more specific because SARS and the N1H1, those were actually coronaviruses as well. So this particular coronavirus is known as COVID-19. So what is this agreement for? Well, first of all, you'll notice it's an addendum or amendment. So an addendum is something that you attach to a contract before it is completed and signed. So if I'm going out on a listing appointment today, I will have my listing agreement, and then as part of that, I will have this RLA CAA. So it's going to be an addendum to my listing agreement. What about the listings that you currently have? For those listings that you currently have, I would contact my seller and I would give them this, have them sign it after you complete it. It would then become an amendment. So an amendment is a change to a current contract, whereas an addendum is an addition to a contract you are creating. So that's the difference between addendums and amendments. So what does this document do? Well, you may recall back during the Great Recession, we were getting a number of short sales. Horrible time for agents, right? Well, we were getting a lot of questions from these sellers of short sales on what's the impact to my credit? What's the risk to me of a short sale? And of course, unless you're a lawyer, you can't answer those questions. Even if you're a lawyer, you don't want to answer those questions because so many of those questions can't be answered, right? Because you don't know all the facts. You may recall CAR came out with a listing, let's say the short sale listing addendum. I think that's what it was called. I haven't seen it in many years. But anyway, the purpose of that addendum was to explain to the seller the difference between a short sale, a foreclosure, a deed in lieu of foreclosure, a loan modification, and how that might affect their credit. So we would add that as an addendum. So if they had questions, they could just read that form so they wouldn't ask us. Well, what this does is it alerts them that, hey, we're going to have property showings. And are you good with property showings? We're also going to have some pre-sale and some they call post-acceptance, or what you would normally refer to as in escrow situations. Now, I'm going to actually pull this thing up so I can actually see it a little bit more clear. Okay. So we just want to have them okay with the fact that we are going to be showing their property in a COVID environment. Under 1A, excuse me, 1B, you can check the box that says you will get verification that any buyer who looks at their property is financially able to purchase the property. And then 1C states, and I know you can't really see it on my PowerPoint, 1C states that the buyers have already seen the property online. So here's the thinking. Sellers will be more at ease knowing that only serious buyers are coming into their property. And as agents representing buyers, it's probably a good idea not to show properties unless you have verified that the buyer is in fact serious. And how do we determine that the buyer is serious? Well, we get him pre-qualified by our lender first, and then we show them that property, perhaps online, virtually, depending on your broker's policies, maybe in your conference room on the monitor, but that a buyer going out to the property is a serious buyer, and there is a strong likelihood that they may make an offer on this particular property. Now, we all know that looking at a property online and looking at a property in person, I mean, sometimes they don't even look like the same properties, right? So we're doing the best we can here to try to limit showings to serious buyers. And then in number 2, we just want to get confirmation from our seller that we can do a virtual tour, take photographs, put signage, conduct our visual inspection. The other agent will be doing their visual inspection. Again, we just want to get confirmation of the things that we normally do in the marketing and during escrow of the property. So again, confirmation from the seller, because most seller, or maybe most sellers, a lot of sellers are not prepared for the amount of intrusion that often happens when a property is put on the market. Now, number 3, broker marketing plan. Again, CAR, myself, we have no idea what type of marketing you do, but again, having the seller sign on to your marketing plan, what marketing you will do with that property, because that might intrude on the seller's comfort zone. And then finally, number 4 at the bottom, this is where if the seller wants to remove the property from the market temporarily, they can do that. Now, the way this clause works is if the seller says, look, I'm just overwhelmed. I don't want this intrusion in my house. I mean, see the news every night. It's crazy out there. I don't want people coming into my house. You say, great, let's take it off the market. So you take it off the market. 2 months later, COVID thing starts to, shall we say, die down, no pun intended. We're starting to see opening of things, and the seller says, okay, I'm ready to bring the property back on the market. Okay, so originally you had taken a 6-month listing on this property, but you had taken the property off for, let's say, 30 or 45 days during the peak of the COVID pandemic. Now you're bringing the property back on. This paragraph says that because the property was off the market, let's say hypothetically 45 days, your listing will now be extended for an additional 45 days to make up for the time that the property was off the market. Now, paragraph 4 doesn't specify a time frame. The reason is we don't know how long the property is going to be off the market. You take the property off the market today, you may bring it back on June 1st or July 1st. We don't know, right? We'll bring the property back on the market when the seller is comfortable in having people look at their property. So if it's 45 days from now, then we will extend the listing 45 days. If it's 30 days from now, we will have then extended the listing for 35 days. Okay, so again, this is going to be an addendum or an amendment to your current listing agreement, advising the sellers of what's going to happen, getting their permission on showings and marketing and in escrow activities that you do. Laura, I think we have a question or two out there.
We have 2 questions so far. So this one I think goes back to the PEAD.
Okay.
Hi, I received a PEAD from a buyer's agent and with no property address. When I asked him to add the property address, he said no, that it is not necessary so long as a listing broker gets a copy. So now I have a signed PEAD by buyer and a separate PEAD signed by the agent with no property address. If I add the property address myself, I think I would be altering a document since it was already signed by the buyer and agent. Can you please advise?
Okay. You raised a really good point. And again, we don't want to cause more drama to transactions. So what I would do, this person is correct. You don't want to add, I would not want to add an address. I would take a piece of paper or a Post-it note and staple it. Don't trust the Post-it note to remain on there by sticking, but staple it to the upper left-hand corner. And on there, I would put the date that you are writing this Post-it note. I would put a reference of the agent, the property address, anything else particular that relates to this document. In other words, this, you are putting on that Post-it note or that piece of paper, you are attaching something here that says on April 22nd, 2020, Robert Realtor sent this to me for such and such a buyer regarding such and such a property, and then put your initial. Staple it on there. I think you're good. So why have a property address on there? Well, the buyer, by signing this, has taken acceptance of the risks of looking at a particular property. I don't see a need to have that property actually on this, because the purpose of this form is to make it more difficult for that buyer to try to sue you because they contracted COVID at your listing. But the fact that they've signed this shows that they've accepted the risk of going into that property. You've now referenced that property that they're going into with your own note, and I think you're fine. And again, this document is supposed to make it more difficult for a buyer or a seller or an appraiser or a home inspector to sue you if they allege they've contracted COVID in your listing. I mean, if you read read the LA Times this morning, there are a number of people who are suing cruise lines, other business establishments, claiming that they contracted COVID at that establishment. Well, you want to make it more difficult for someone to try to make that claim, and that's the purpose of this form. So I wouldn't be overly concerned that it doesn't have a property address, but attaching your note, letting them know what property it is, putting a date on there, I think you're fine at that point. All right. Next question.
What is your advice to using this form regarding multi-units sales / marketing?
I think this form should be liberally used. Anybody you come in contact with, it's not a bad idea to use this form, okay? So again, whether it's single family dwellings, apartments, just the mere fact that you're interacting with people, it's not a bad idea to have them sign this form. So again, that's why I would extend it to appraisers, home inspectors, contractors that are doing work on the property. I would use this form liberally and just say, it's my policy, or it's my office policy, my broker's policy, that everybody that we come in contact with in our real estate dealings, we make them aware of the COVID-19 risk. And that's what this does. So again, hopefully your brokers, your managers will start developing a policy on these forms, but I would use it liberally. I mean, again, treat it as if you're going bungee cord dropping or skydiving or scuba diving. They always give you a disclaimer form, right? And they have you sign away. That's essentially what this form does. So it doesn't create any obligation. It doesn't create any contractual requirements. It's just a disclosure that if you're going out into properties, there is some risk of the COVID virus. Anything else?
Well, there's a couple comments that the forms have already changed already, so I don't know if you want to repeat what you said earlier.
Okay, so for those of you come in, these forms seem to be changing weekly. I was talking to Laura this morning as to whether I should try to update my PowerPoint right now, but unfortunately, the PowerPoint that she has already sent out to you and is on the website is with these forms. So to try to make it more, shall I say, consistent, we are going with the forms that were valid last week. This week we have a new set of forms. What I'll be doing is this afternoon, I will be updating this PowerPoint as well as the handout. I'm going to then send it to Laura, and she's going to post it on the website, and she can send it out to you. So yes, these forms are changing. The intent of the form remains the same. CAR rolled these forms out. As soon as they did, there were changes. They rolled them out again. And now we're in the third version of the form. So yes, they are tweaking. I'd also like to make a comment that this form here has a property management version. So if you are showing properties to prospective tenants, you are picking up a landlord as a property management client, there is a PEAD-LR, which will be for listing agreements, or excuse me, for lease agreements or leasing. We also have a new form called the NTAP. It is a notice to tenant to pay rent in a COVID environment. So as some of you are familiar with, tenants, if they have lost their job or have a reduction in hours because of COVID, then they don't have to pay rent. But their inability to pay rent has to be related to COVID. If they have not lost their job, if they have not suffered a loss in hours, they are still obligated to pay their rent. So there is a new property management form to inform the tenant that unless your inability to pay rent is related to COVID, you still have to pay rent, okay? I had a situation come at me the other day where a property is in escrow and it fell out because the tenant won't move out, arguing COVID. Well, they still have their jobs. They're still fully employed. COVID has not affected them. They just don't want to move out. That is not grounds. So that tenant now is running the risk of being sued by the landlord seller for screwing up their real estate transaction. So again, all these forms here directly relate to COVID, okay? And we're going to talk more about that when we get into our next form, which is the CVA, all right? Anything else, Laura, before I go to the next form?
No, we're good.
Okay, so our next form, and this is kind of the form that started it all. This is the Coronavirus Addendum, or CVA. So this form is going to attach to your purchase agreement, either as an offer or as a fully signed purchase agreement. So if we go into this form, and I'm going to pull it up on my tablet here so I can actually see it. Give me a minute. We need to let our buyers and sellers know that during escrow, we may have something happen that will make it difficult or impossible for the buyer or possibly the seller to perform. So numbers 1, 2, and 3 basically explain what's going on with COVID. Right? Paragraph 4 then is to have the parties state what's going to happen if we have a COVID problem and the buyer or possibly the seller cannot perform. So you will either go with A and B, or you will go with C. So C is a cancellation. A is an extension of time for contingency removal, and B is an extension of time for the buyer or seller to close escrow. So let's talk about 4A first. The default language, or the pre-printed language, states that if the buyer is not able to remove their contingencies, then that contingency period will be extended for 30 days. So you know we have two basic contingency time periods, For appraisal, inspection, and investigation, we have 17 days. For loan approval, we have 21 days. It is possible that the property cannot get an appraisal because they can't get an appraiser out there to appraise the property due to COVID. Likewise, your property inspector may not be able to get out there and complete their inspection because of COVID. Okay? Your lender may not be able to give loan approval to your buyer because of COVID. So if you have a problem and the buyer needs to extend their contingencies, this form says it will be extended for 30 days. Now, you can make that longer or shorter. You could change it from 30 days to 15 days, or you could make it from 30 days to 45 days. But the thought was make it 30 days. That should give plenty of time. Paragraph 4B is an extension of time for the buyer or seller to close escrow. So let's say hypothetically, you get ready to close escrow. Escrow is supposed to close on the 22nd of April, but you can't because the county recorder's office is closed. Or you can't because there's a break in the download link between the title plant and the county recorder's office, and the title company will not allow the documents to be recorded because they can't do their final check to make sure there's no last minute liens or encumbrances popping up on the property. These things could happen. So we have an extension period of up to 30 days for that as well. And again, you can make it longer or shorter, right? So that's the extension of time. Or we go with C, which says, if the buyer or the seller cannot perform under the timeframes in the contract, 17 days, the 21 days, the escrow period of 45 days, whatever, if they cannot perform, then C will be checked and it will be mutual cancellation. So as you're negotiating your purchase agreement, you're asking the buyer and the seller to make a decision, what if? What if the buyer needs more time before removing their contingencies? What if the buyer needs more time to close escrow? Either we agree to give the buyer more time, or hypothetically the seller more time, because there is a contingency clause in a document. I always forget the name of the document, begins with an S, that can give the seller up to 17 days to find a replacement property, right? We're familiar with that document. You probably know the name of it. I don't, because it slipped my mind. But anyway, will we give the parties more time? Or do we go with C and say, time's up, we're going to cancel? Now, I would hate to use the 4C, because if you do have cancellation, that's a shame, because you have essentially a ready, able, willing buyer and seller taking that property out of contract, out of escrow, putting it back on the MLS. It could be months, given our environment, before we get into escrow again. So I would encourage you to go with 4A and 4C, 4A and 4B. If you don't like the 30 days, you can shorten them, or you can lengthen them, depending on what the parties want to do. What do you do if a buyer or a seller says, why are we doing this? You know, there is a concept at law known as impossibility. Impossibility, also known under its French term, and my French is terrible, so forgive me if I mispronounce it, force majeure, states that if a party cannot perform through no fault of their own, due to something that was completely unforeseen, then the party would be allowed to escape liability and walk away from the transaction. So that is a legal principle, force majeure. And I think what CAR is doing here is they are recognizing that that is a valid defense to a party to a real estate transaction. So even if you had a party trying to hold them to the agreement keep their deposit as liquidated damages, a court probably wouldn't support it. So knowing that, it is better to have this issue addressed, have the buyer and seller be aware of the uncertainty, and should something happen, we address how it's going to be resolved. Laura, any questions on this form?
No.
That's great. I did a good job there. Okay, so our last form, the notice of unforeseen coronavirus circumstances. So this form follows the form before. So under 4A, 4B, or 4C, we've got a problem in our transaction, and we either need more time or we need to cancel. And the problem is because of COVID. So what we have here is the notice that the party that is not able to perform gives to the other party. So let me use the buyer as an example because that's going to probably be more common. The buyer's inability not to be able to perform under the contract will typically fall under A, B, or C. If it doesn't fall under A, B, or C, then you put it under D because it's something that CAR hasn't thought of yet, right? So what is A, B, and C? Well, A is loan related. The buyer's having problems getting their loan because of COVID. Or B, the shelter in place is making it difficult for the buyer to perform. For example, the seller is not feeling well and they can't do the home inspection. Or a government required inspection is mandated because you are in a city where they do have those point of sale inspections, but you can't get anybody from the city to come out and inspect the property because of COVID. Same thing with pest control or appraisal. Or C, there is a personal impact. The seller has COVID and nobody wants to go in the house. So the buyer needs more time. Or the seller can't move out because there's no place for them to go because they've got COVID and they've got to stay in the house for another 14, 20 days or whatever. Okay, so the buyer needs to tell the seller, which is it? Is it A? Is it B? Is it C? Is it D? Or is it a combination of it? All right. And then under E, how this makes it difficult or impossible for the buyer to perform. Now, some of it may be a little bit more self-explanatory, but we allow for further explanation under E. And then number 2, the verification of the condition. It's not just enough for the buyer to say, hey, I need more time because of COVID. Prove it. Give us something from the lender, the appraiser, the home inspector. Give us something on the or from the city website saying point of sale inspections will not be done for the next 2 weeks. Show us some evidence or proof or verification that the reason the buyer is unable to perform is in fact related to COVID. All right. So again, this is a trend that CAR is making with their forms. I know many of you were expecting us to get a new purchase agreement this year. That's been put off for another year. But in the drafts I have seen of the new 16-page purchase agreement, if the buyer wants to cancel based on their 17-day inspection contingency, they're going to need to give a reason why. You know, currently they don't have to do that. But my understanding is in the new form, they are going to be asked to do that. So again, this is a direction that CAR is going, and I think that's reflected in number 2 here. It's not just enough for the buyer to say, I need more time because of COVID. You've got to show evidence that it is in fact COVID that they need more time. Laura, do we have any questions on this form?
We do not.
Okay. So let me do a little summation and then we'll throw it out to any other questions. Okay. If you can, try doing your open houses and showings virtually again, as much as you can. I've been on some virtual open houses. Um, it kind of reminds me the first time I learned how to drive a manual transmission. It's a little jerky now, but we're going to get better, okay? But do as much virtual showings as you can. Try to get your buyers pre-qualified or pre-approved. Make sure they've seen the property before you show them. We don't want to just show properties to looky-loos because that's going to cause stress for our sellers and it puts you at risk as well. For those of you who have not been spending a lot of time working on your sphere of influence, this is a great time to do it. If you're a broker or if you have a CRM, now is the time to develop it. You see, we're going to come out of this thing. I don't know if we're going to come out of this thing on May 1st or June 1st or whatever. I don't know if we're going to go back in winter. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with COVID, but it's going to be with us for a while. This is a good time to get yourself ramped up so when the danger decreases, you can hit the ground running. Please maintain good relationships with your seller as the seller's agent, all right? This is an important time to keep the seller in the loop. Go online. There is good news out there with COVID, okay? We are seeing plateaus. We are seeing decreases in many states. We are seeing that in areas of California. If you see some good news, share that with your sellers, okay? My recommendation is give your sellers a phone call a couple of times a week. It's not like you have anything else to do, right? We're stuck in our house. Call your seller, see how things are going. They would really appreciate a call from you. And then property showings, when you're the buyer's agents, always call ahead for the seller's permission. Ask them how they're feeling. If they ask who the buyer is, say, I talked to my buyer said they're feeling well today. Give them that little insurance. Use of gloves. It makes people feel better if they see you in gloves because they see that you're taking precautions. But remember, the gloves are to keep your hands clean while you're doing something. They don't protect your hands. You do not catch or contract the virus from touching it. You get it from touching it and then touching your face. So use your gloves, but then as you leave the area that might be infected or tainted, take the gloves off, properly dispose them in a trash receptacle in your trunk. That way, when you get into your car stays relatively clean. Follow good lockbox etiquette and safety, as I mentioned earlier. And then as you're going through the property, avoid touching surfaces during showings. Always a good idea to offer gloves to your clients as well. And then, and this is the big thing, try to avoid drama in your negotiations and cancellations. I've often said that more deals probably are killed by agents behaving badly than buyers and sellers behaving badly, okay? So again, you're gonna be dealing with agents that are going to be a little dramatic. Just try to, as we talked earlier, you've got an agent that won't put a property address on the PEAD form. Okay, you asked, attach a note, try to get them to put the address on the form. They did not. This was for property, blank, blank, blank. Staple that note to that form. I think you're good there, all right? Laura, any last minute questions?
No, we don't have any questions.
Okay, so my summary here is you have my phone number, but don't call me because that's to my school office. And of course, while Mount SAC is still offering classes online, campus is shut down. But if you want to talk about things, send me an email. I offer this with the caveat, as you see below, I cannot give you legal advice, but I can certainly share education. So if we want to talk about a form or how a form works or what the law is, I'm happy to discuss that. But if you have a situation with a particular client and you want to know what you should do, I can't help you there, okay? More often than not, you need to send them to an attorney. Laura, I think a question popped up on the screen, did it?
It's a thank you.
Oh, I like thank yous. Well, thank you very much. Laura, do you have any other things to say?
I don't. I
Okay.
don't. Other than, your PowerPoint presentation, once it's already up on the Tri-County's website now, but once you update it, we'll update it as well. And it's on the Tri-County's website under the education tab.
Okay. And my next webinar is not until 11 o'clock. So I think there's a really good chance I'm going to be able to get this update to Laura before 11. So that's going to be my goal right now.
Great.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for joining us, everyone.